One ordinary morning in a small-town courtroom, a ragged stray dog wandered through the heavy oak doors, silent, thin, and carrying something that would change everything. Why did he come? And how did this forgotten animal end up holding the key to a buried truth? It was a chilly morning in a small-town courtroom, where the case of the year was underway, drawing crowds of curious townsfolk, journalists scribbling notes, and legal teams on edge. The atmosphere buzzed with tension as David Hollis, a well-dressed and powerful businessman, sat stiffly in the defendant's chair. He had been accused of embezzling millions meant for children's charities, medical research, and community housing, money meant to help the helpless, stolen by someone who already had more than enough. Across the room, the sharp and determined prosecutor, Elaine Morgan, readied her final arguments. Judge Martha Campbell, a woman known for her stern demeanor and no-nonsense courtroom, sat tall behind the bench, her gavel within reach. Every seat was filled, every heart holding its breath. And then, just as Morgan stood to speak, something no one could have expected happened. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open slowly, but no person entered. Instead, the sound of soft footsteps, light and unhurried, echoed through the marble floor. It was a stray dog, thin, dusty, ribs showing under his matted coat. Yet, his eyes, warm and full of something unexplainable, scanned the room as though he knew exactly where he was. He walked calmly down the center aisle, past rows of stunned spectators and legal officials frozen in confusion. He reached the middle of the courtroom, stopped, and let out a bark. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, deliberate. The room hushed. The bailiff, unsure what to do, stepped forward to remove the dog, but then the dog barked again, louder. This time, everyone turned toward the animal. His gaze was locked, not on the judge, not on the audience, but on the defendant, David Hollis. The dog barked a third time. That last bark echoed through the courtroom like a call from something higher, something that couldn't be ignored. Then, as though his message had been delivered, the dog sat down quietly, his tail moving faintly across the floor. For a long moment, no one spoke. Judge Campbell narrowed her eyes, puzzled. Even she, with all her years of courtroom experience, seemed lost in the strangeness of the moment. Then, the bailiff noticed something. Dangling from the dog's collar was a small rusty key. It swung gently under the courtroom lights, catching a beam that danced across the judge's face. He stepped forward, reached down slowly, and unhooked the key from the dog's collar. "Your Honor," he said, holding the key up for everyone to see. This was on the dog's neck. A hush fell again. Judge Campbell furrowed her brow. "What does it unlock?" she asked, her voice quiet, but curious. Elaine Morgan stepped forward, asking to examine the key. She turned it over in her hands, her face going pale. "I recognize this," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. She looked up, her voice now firm. "This key, it belongs to a private storage unit in town, one that we believe is connected to Mr. Hollis. One we haven't been able to access, until now." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Hollis shifted in his seat, his confidence faltering for the first time, as he glanced nervously at the dog, who had not moved an inch. "This is absurd," his lawyer cried, but the room wasn't listening. Everyone's eyes were on the dog, this quiet, steady animal, who had just walked in off the street, and handed them the very thing they had been desperately searching for. It was as if fate itself had delivered the evidence. Hollis sat like a man whose walls were finally cracking, a mask slipping off slowly, under the weight of an innocent creature's gaze. Morgan held the key tighter. "Your Honor," she said, "I believe this key gives us probable cause to search that unit immediately." Judge Campbell paused, weighing the strange moment in front of her, then nodded. "Request granted. Bailiff, escort the prosecutor." The courtroom broke into murmurs. The dog, this dusty, brave little wanderer, stayed where he was, sitting tall and quiet like a sentinel, who knew his job was not yet done. They would learn later that this wasn't just any dog, that he had a name, and a past, and had once been discarded by the very man he now helped bring down. But in this moment, all that mattered was the key, the truth it might unlock, and the strange, powerful feeling that swept through the room, one of awe, one of wonder, and for many, one of hope. The old woman in the back row wiped away a tear. She had lived through years of trials, both legal and personal, but she had never seen anything like this. A dog, of all things, walking in and changing everything. It was as though the universe had grown tired of waiting on justice, and had sent it in the form of a creature no one expected. Judge Campbell, steadying her breath, leaned forward slightly. She had seen a lot in her career, but nothing like this. She didn't know yet what the key would reveal, but she knew one thing for certain: this was no ordinary dog, and this would be no ordinary case. And as the dog sat still, eyes clear and calm, no one doubted anymore. He hadn't wandered in by mistake. He had come with a purpose. The courtroom, usually a place of law and logic, now buzzed with something older, deeper, a feeling that truth, no matter how long buried, would always find its way home, even if it came on four legs. The story of the dog, now called Justice, began to unfold like something from an old heartfelt movie, the kind that leaves a lump in your throat and warmth in your heart. Long before he ever walked into that courtroom, before he carried the key that would unlock a hidden truth, he had another name. He was once called Max, and he wasn't always a stray. He had once been owned, once had a purpose, and once had a home. But life has a way of testing even the purest souls, and Max's path would twist through loss and loneliness. Before he became the quiet hero the world didn't know it needed. Many miles away from the courtroom, on the outskirts of town, lived a man named Henry Dawson, a retired locksmith in his late 70s. Henry lived alone on a struggling little farm, surrounded by rusting tools and fading memories. His wife had passed years earlier, and his children had long since moved to cities far away. The days were long, quiet, and often cold. But everything changed one stormy night, when a soft scratching sound echoed at his back door. Henry opened it to find a soaked, shivering dog, looking up at him, with tired, searching eyes. The old man's heart cracked open. Without a second thought, he brought the dog inside, wrapped him in an old flannel blanket, and fed him what little food he had. The dog didn't growl or beg. He simply rested his head on Henry's knee, as if he'd found something he had lost long ago. Henry named him Justice. He didn't know why at the time, but the name felt right. Maybe it was the way the dog carried himself, calm and watchful, or maybe Henry just knew that they had both been through storms, literally and figuratively, and had found each other when they needed someone the most. Over the months, the two grew inseparable. Justice followed Henry everywhere, around the fields, to the tool shed, and even into town when he picked up supplies. Henry, who had once spoken only to himself or the birds in the trees, now talked to Justice like a dear friend. The farm slowly came back to life. But Justice carried more than just a gentle spirit. He carried a secret. Tucked under his dusty collar was a key. Henry, being a locksmith, noticed it, but didn't think much of it at first. It looked old and familiar, but he assumed it belonged to the dog's former owner. It wasn't until prosecutor Elaine Morgan came knocking that the key's true importance was revealed. After the courtroom event, with the dog and the discovery of the key, Morgan traced Justice to Henry's farm, eager to understand who this mysterious animal was. When Henry saw the key she brought with her, his eyes widened. "I made that key," he said, his voice heavy with surprise. He remembered it clearly. It was a custom job from years ago, made for none other than David Hollis himself. At the time, Hollis had paid him extra to stay quiet about the private storage unit the key unlocked. Henry had thought little of it back then. Now he realized Justice had been holding on to the very item that could bring Hollis's crimes to light. As Morgan pieced the story together, a picture began to form. Justice wasn't just a lucky stray. He was a trained dog who had once worked for Hollis. Evidence began to emerge that Hollis had used dogs like Justice for private security. But when Justice failed to meet Hollis's harsh expectations, he had been abandoned, discarded like old furniture. It was heartbreaking, especially for Henry, who now saw his loyal companion in a whole new light. Justice had suffered betrayal, loneliness and rejection, but had found his way to kindness again. And when the time came, he brought the key, not to hurt, but to heal. He returned to the man who cast him aside, not with teeth bared, but with the truth in his mouth, and that truth was heavy. Hollis and his team, desperate to save themselves, tried to discredit the dog. They presented a grainy video in court, showing Justice barking and lunging at a man at a construction site. They claimed he was aggressive, dangerous, unreliable, but the truth, like always, found a way through. The full footage came out, unedited and clear. It showed Justice rushing toward a child who had wandered into a hazardous area, placing himself between the child and falling debris. He wasn't attacking, he was saving a life. Gasps filled the courtroom as the truth was played out on screen. The defense's lie crumbled. Justice had once again proved himself, not only to the judge and jury, but to the entire town. He wasn't acting on rage, he was acting on instinct, the kind born not from training alone, but from a deep, unshakable sense of loyalty. Every time Hollis tried to twist the story to bend the truth into something it wasn't, Justice simply stood firm, silent, and steadfast. He didn't need to speak, his actions had always done that for him. What became clear to everyone, even the most skeptical, was that this dog, once abandoned, once considered useless, was not only key to the trial, but to the very heart of the story. The townspeople began to whisper his name with reverence. Children who had never even seen him drew pictures of him in school. Old-timers nodded in approval whenever his name was mentioned. He had become something rare, a symbol of truth, resilience, and unconditional love. Back on the farm, Henry sat on his porch with Justice at his feet, watching the sun set behind the hills. He would sometimes look down and say, "You're not just a dog, are you? You're something more." Justice would look back at him with calm eyes, eyes that seemed to say, "I've been through the dark, but I found my way to the light, and I'm not going back." And neither would Henry. The old man's life had changed forever. He had found companionship when he least expected it, and his quiet farm had become the starting point of a journey that would lead to redemption, not just for Justice, but for himself. For every older soul who's ever known loneliness or felt forgotten, the story of Justice is a gentle reminder that it's never too late for new beginnings, and that sometimes the ones who are most broken are the ones who show us the way back to hope. In the final days of the trial, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of cold procedure. It had become the stage for something far deeper, a space where truth, redemption, and healing came together under the quiet gaze of a dog who had already endured more than anyone knew. As more evidence poured in, new secrets were revealed. David Hollis, once seen as a generous businessman, was now exposed for what he truly was, a man who stole from the weak, hid his crimes behind layers of wealth and charm, and used animals as tools, discarding them like broken things when they no longer served his needs. Justice had been one of them, once trained to follow commands, once expected to obey without fail. Justice had failed only in the eyes of a man too blind to see the heart inside him. When Justice didn't meet Hollis's impossible standards, he was cast out, abandoned like forgotten luggage. But he didn't grow bitter. He didn't turn vicious. He wandered, wounded but not broken, until fate brought him to Henry's doorstep. And Henry, a man who had also been left behind in many ways, opened his door and his heart. It was no coincidence that the two found each other. Justice found love, and Henry found life again. So when the trial came, and the time was right, Justice didn't run from the past. He walked straight into it. He returned not to hurt the man who had wronged him, but to tell the truth. Through silence and presence, through a key hanging from his collar, he revealed a story no one else could have told. And the truth, as it always does, rose to the surface. Prosecutor Elaine Morgan presented the evidence that linked Hollis not only to theft, but also to cruelty and neglect. The jury sat in stunned silence as the pieces came together: the storage units, the fake accounts, the abandoned dogs, the trail of lies. But what spoke loudest wasn't paperwork or legal jargon. It was just sitting calmly by Henry's feet, quiet but unshakable. His very existence had become proof that good could rise from betrayal, that hope could outlive hardship. Hollis tried one last time to twist the narrative, to argue that the dog's actions were just coincidence, but no one was listening anymore. The jury saw him for what he was, and they saw Justice for who he had always been. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the room erupted, not in celebration, but in relief. Judge Martha Campbell, usually composed and stoic, looked down at the dog who had changed everything. "Justice," she said, her voice softening, "is more than your name. You've reminded us all of what true loyalty and courage look like." Henry bent down and wrapped his arms around Justice, his eyes full of tears. Morgan, speaking to the press afterward, said what everyone felt. This wasn't just a legal victory, it was a story of healing, of love, found again in the most unexpected way. Justice reminded us that no one is ever truly lost, and that sometimes the ones who were thrown away are the ones who bring us back to what matters most. Justice returned to Henry's farm, not to rest, but to live. The quiet life that followed was filled with purpose and peace. The town honored him with a special day, every year, Justice Day. Children learned about his bravery in school, statues were discussed, local artists painted murals, donations poured into shelters across the county under a campaign called Justice's Legacy. Henry spoke at community centers and schools, always with Justice at his side. "He's more than a dog," he would say, his voice trembling. "He's proof that loyalty never dies, even when it's thrown away." On the farm, life settled into a rhythm. Justice followed Henry through the fields, waited beside him at the barn, and curled up at his feet on the porch, as the sun dipped behind the trees. Each evening, as the crickets sang and the wind rustled through the wheat, Henry would look down and whisper, "You saved me, old boy. You gave me life again." And Justice, as if understanding every word, would wag his tail gently, eyes half closed in peace. But the world didn't forget. Across the country, news stations and magazines covered the story of the stray dog who changed everything. He became a symbol, not just of justice served, but of second chances, of bonds that go beyond words. Morgan, inspired by the case, founded an organization also called Justice's Legacy, that worked to rescue and rehome abandoned animals, partnering with shelters and farms, to give both animals and people a second shot at happiness. Henry became its quiet heart, not seeking praise, but always showing up. He and Justice would greet new volunteers, sit in the back at fundraisers, and wave humbly when people asked for pictures, but fame never changed them. On the farm, they were just two old souls who had found each other in the storm, and held on. Sometimes reporters would visit, and Henry would invite them to sit and sip tea as the sun set. "The world's a noisy place," he would say, "but out here, it's quiet enough to hear what matters." And he was right, because in that quiet, in the soft thud of paws on dirt, and the creak of a rocking chair, you could still feel the heart of a story that began with a lost dog, a lonely man, and a key that unlocked far more than a storage unit. It unlocked heart. And in the years that followed, even as Justice grew older and his steps slowed, his spirit never faded. Children would still come visit the farm, some would lay flowers near the gate, others would leave little hand-drawn notes that read, "Thank you, Justice." On one special evening, the town held a candlelight walk in his honor. People of all ages showed up, holding signs that said "Loyalty lives on," and "Every dog deserves a Henry." And through it all, Henry and Justice stood together, side by side, proving that even in a world filled with shadows, the light of one loyal heart can guide the way. In the end, Justice didn't just help put a criminal behind bars, he restored something far more precious. He reminded a weary town of what it meant to believe again. He healed a heart that had almost given up, and he taught everyone watching that love, when given freely, returns in ways you can never imagine. So now when Henry sits on that porch, his hand resting gently on the back of the dog who saved him, he smiles and whispers to the stars, "Thank you, boy, for everything, for finding your way home, for helping me do the same." And somewhere, far beyond the clouds, you get the feeling the stars are wagging their tails.